Of all the stages along the Buddhist Eightfold Path, right concentration may be the most obscure. It's also the eighth and final stage on the Eightfold Path, where while understanding that right views, having certain intentions, behaving ethically, even being mindful and making certain kinds of effort, those seem relatively understandable. But samadhi, which is the word for concentration, is something of a different matter. It's a little bit more complicated and, again, obscure what that samadhi really is and why it's important. In today's video, I will be using as background this great work, good work from Bhante Gunaratana called 8 Mindful Steps to Happiness. It's a book where he discusses the Eightfold Path. I'm not going to be following his work in any great detail, but again, it's good background. If you want to read more about all of this, I would suggest it as a place to start. And Bhante Gunaratana calls this skillful concentration. Now again, the word here is samadhi. That's the Pali word, which is translated concentration. But there are a number of other possible translations for the term, such as unification, again, concentration, maybe even immersion. And different people like different ones of these translations and don't like others. But the basic idea is relatively clear, that it's something that's the opposite of the ordinary state of mind, where our mind is dispersed and distracted and set amongst a bunch of different things. Instead, we are bringing the mind together to a state where it is more unified, more controlled in a sense, more focused. And these are all ways we can understand the term samadhi. Some of us will have experience with what are known as flow states, where perhaps we are playing a musical instrument or in some sports where we're very, very focused on the task at hand, perhaps in our work, where the entire rest of the world seems to vanish, seems to go away. We're no longer aware of anything going on around us except the task that we're focused on. And that kind of flow state is the sort of thing we're looking for in samadhi. Here the mind is controlled, it's focused, it's unified. In one early sutta, the nun Dhammadina describes the entire Buddhist path as being split into 3 parts: ethics, meditation, and wisdom. But the word she uses for meditation is samadhi, this very same word. And so in her description, there's a sense in which samadhi sort of covers all of our meditative practices. That is to say, it's not just concentration, like we've just discussed, but it also includes such things as mindfulness practice, as effort generally, even as some ancillary practices like guarding the sense doors, which we do to help, again, focus the mind and keep it from becoming distracted and dispersed. And when asked about the development of this samadhi, Dhammadina describes it as developed in 3 ways. First, through the 4 right efforts, which were the sort of prerequisites for samadhi, and then through the 4 foundations of mindfulness, which was sort of understood to be the foundation of samadhi, which we'll get to in a bit. And then third, through this unification of mind itself, which is samadhi itself. So there's sort of 3 stages, again, in this long process of developing concentration or samadhi. Elsewhere, the Buddha talks about right concentration, including with its supports and prerequisites, the entire Eightfold Path. And looked at in this way, we can sort of think of right concentration, again, this samadhi, as being quite a comprehensive kind of understanding of practice that includes, again, either all of meditation practice or indeed all of Buddhist practice together, that right samadhi, in a sense, includes everything within it. But right concentration also has a narrower meaning, and one that is a good deal more esoteric. This narrow meaning is the one that many scholars believe is perhaps the primary meaning of right concentration. That is to say that right concentration, truly understood, really refers to pursuit of what are known as the 4 jhanas. The 4 jhanas, these are 4 states of ever-deepening absorptive meditative practice. Now, Bhante Gunaratana describes these in his book if you want to learn more about them from his perspective, but just in a nutshell, the first of these jhanas is a state of mind where a kind of bubbling joy and happiness arises within us during our meditation. It seems to arise from nowhere. And then, as our practice deepens into the second, third, and fourth jhana, this kind of pleasurable happiness becomes ever more refined until what we're left with is a state which is known as one of mindful equanimity. It's said to be a state that is so pleasurable that it is beyond our ordinary description of pleasure. So it's beyond ordinary pleasure. It's a pleasure beyond ordinary pleasure, as how it's described. It's basically the pleasure of this kind of equanimity. Now, reaching jhana is probably something that most lay people are not going to achieve. They're not going to be interested in that. You probably, I don't know, but you may not be interested in it because it does take a great deal of time and effort on the meditation cushion to get there. Probably several hours of meditation per day over a long period of time. Probably, most likely, under the guidance of a skilled and experienced teacher. It's not the sort of thing that's very easy to achieve and not the sort of thing that you can achieve by wanting to achieve it either. It's something that simply arises on its own. There are additionally a number of controversies over these states of jhana, which is one of the reasons I consider them somewhat esoteric. To begin with, there is a controversy over whether such jhanas are really necessary to the path. Do we really need to achieve them to get where we're going? In the contemporary Vipassana or insight movement, that historically has been a movement that has tended to downplay the importance of these kinds of jhanic states or achievements. In the insight movement, it's believed that while jhana can be useful to people, it's not necessary, that you can gain enlightenment without it, simply by having insight into the characteristics of reality. I will say that this position that jhana isn't necessary has, at least in my anecdotal experience, been becoming somewhat less popular nowadays, but it definitely is still there. There's also a separate controversy over how deep these jhanic states have to be considered qualified jhanic states. For example, there's one very accomplished and famous lay meditation teacher, perhaps the most famous, a man named Lee Brasington, wonderful teacher. He tends to teach what are known as more light states of jhana. They're ones that are somewhat easier to achieve. We don't need quite as long, quite as deep a practice to get there. On the other hand, many more famous Theravada jhana teachers tend to say that these light states of jhana aren't really jhana. They teach states that are much deeper, more, we might say, absorptive, that take longer to achieve, where the world is more excluded from our experience when we're in them. And so the question is, which is a true jhana and which is not? Are the deep states really necessary? Or are the light states enough? Or do the light states qualify as jhana? These are the kinds of controversies that practitioners have arguments about. What is clear from the suttas, however, is that the Buddha's own enlightenment experience occurred after his exit from the fourth jhana. So some of us may wonder, what is the role then of mindfulness meditation here? Because we're often seen to be taught that mindfulness is kind of the royal road to enlightenment in a certain sense. Well, if we look at the four foundations of mindfulness, the key text on doing mindfulness practice, that ends with mindfulness of the Four Noble Truths. However, that last section is believed to be a later interpolation. In other words, most scholars believe that really, originally, or earlier on, the four foundations of mindfulness ended with mindfulness of the seven factors of enlightenment or awakening. And these 7 factors of enlightenment or awakening are very closely related to states of jhāna. In other words, among these 7 factors are factors that are repeated in jhānic understanding, states of samadhi, states of concentration, states of equanimity. And that seems to imply that mindfulness meditation or mindfulness practice culminates in concentration, culminates in samadhi, in right concentration at the final analysis. And that seems to imply that mindfulness practice itself culminates in samadhi, that it culminates in jhāna, that it culminates in right concentration. And indeed that makes perfect sense if we think of the Eightfold Path as one where right mindfulness then leads to right concentration. Some teachers indeed believe that that was the original point of mindfulness practice. That is, that it wasn't supposed to lead to insight, as it's understood in, again, many schools nowadays, but rather that originally mindfulness was to lead to samadhi, to jhāna. And of course that would make sense insofar as we think of the path as roughly a linear path. The Eightfold Path is roughly linear. Now in my course, which I'll leave a link to down below, I argue that I think the best way to think of the Eightfold Path is kind of as a spiral path, that we sort of go back over and over again, but at higher levels, if you like. Or we can also think of the path as one that we pursue all at once. That is to say, we don't pursue one path factor at a time, except incidentally, but in fact, as we gain experience, we're in fact practicing the whole path at the same time. That would make sense if we think of the sutta I just mentioned, where the Buddha says that right concentration includes all these path factors as it supports and prerequisites. In that sense, when we practice right concentration, we're sort of practicing the whole path at the same time. Now, most of us will not be pursuing jhāna, or at least we're not going to be pursuing it in any way that's going to make us an expert. Nevertheless, samadhi practice of right concentration in a more general sense, can be extremely useful to us. It can help us to organize our mind and not be too easily knocked off kilter or off balance by external events, because we have our mind focused through a simple practice such as mindfulness of breathing, which after all is in its essence a practice of samadhi, of concentration, of moving the mind when it becomes distracted or pulled off, moving it back to its meditation subject, which is the breath. Additionally, while, as we've just seen, jhāna may be understood to sort of proceed from mindfulness practice, samadhi or concentration can also be very much thought of as a prerequisite for mindfulness practice. If our minds are distracted, we're not going to be mindful. So it is through concentration, through this kind of concentration, that we become more mindful, that our mindfulness practice advances. And so this is a way in which, even though we may not be pursuing the very far reaches of right samadhi or right concentration, nevertheless, the practice is useful to us. Indeed, right concentration is absolutely essential in gaining a mind that is more malleable and healthy for us, and where we can use it to see more clearly the way things really are. Now, if you're interested in these deeper states of meditation within Buddhist practice and early Buddhist history, I've got a playlist all about these states, and I'll leave a link to that playlist up here on the screen if you haven't seen some of those videos or would like to refresh your memory. Thanks so much for watching. If you're getting something out of these videos of mine, consider taking a look at my Patreon page, which is linked up here on the screen and down below in the notes, and see if you want to help support the channel and the work that I'm doing here. Thanks so much, and we'll catch you on the next video, and meanwhile, all of you, be well.